Crestwood County, a semi-rural region in southwestern Pennsylvania, was submerged in the deep calm of late May. Briar Creek, a gentle river that wound through Lamon Township, was draped each morning in a hazy, ethereal mist, like a bolt of white silk. The air, crisp and cool, carried the scent of young corn and damp earth, bringing a sense of peace to anyone who breathed it in. But the tranquility of the morning of May 20th, 2022, was shattered by a horrifying discovery. As was his habit, Mr. Arthur Finch, a resident of the small village of Briarwood, woke while it was still dark to go for his morning exercise. At 65, a walk of a few miles each morning was an indispensable routine that kept him spry. As he walked along the narrow concrete path that followed the bank of Briar Creek through a deserted field, Mr. Finch suddenly stopped. He squinted, staring intently into the water. Beneath the early morning mist that had yet to burn off, something large and dark lay motionless under the surface, just a few meters from the bank. At first, he thought it was a large rock or a tree stump washed down by a flood. But as the sun began to rise, casting its first rays onto the water, Mr. Finch realized it was the roof of a car. A sense of unease ran down his spine. This road was desolate and rarely used, especially at night. He hurried back to the village to call for a few able-bodied men and notify the town supervisor. The news was quickly reported to the Lamon Township Police. A short time later, authorities were on the scene, cordoning off the area. News of a car submerged in Briar Creek spread like wildfire, drawing hundreds of curious residents. A palpable anxiety hung in the air as they speculated about the fate of those inside the ill-fated vehicle. A rescue tow truck was dispatched. A steel cable as thick as a man's arm was hooked to the car's frame. Under the direction of the police, the car was slowly pulled from the water as everyone held their breath. Water gushed from the interior, carrying mud and algae with it. Once the vehicle was fully on the bank, it was identifiable as a black Toyota Camry, a luxurious and expensive car. But the sight inside was what stunned everyone into silence. Through the intact windshield, a man could be seen sitting upright in the driver's seat. He was dressed in a neat business suit, his hands still resting lightly on the steering wheel. Stranger still, his seatbelt was securely fastened across his chest. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of any attempt to escape. The man looked as if he were merely in a deep sleep in his car, submerged in the cold heart of the river. The victim was quickly identified as Ethan Hayes, 40, the director of Regal Construction Trade, a well-known local business. Initially, based on observations at the scene, most people, including a few junior police officers, assumed it was a tragic traffic accident. Perhaps due to the dark, foggy night, the victim had lost control of the wheel, causing the car to plunge into the river. His failure to escape could have been due to losing consciousness after the impact, a logical and seemingly indisputable scenario. However, amidst the crowd and chaos, one man remained silent, his gaze sharp and cold. He was Lieutenant Mason Grant, head of the Major Crimes Unit of the Pennsylvania State Police. With nearly 20 years of experience and hundreds of cases under his belt, Lieutenant Grant possessed an unusually keen intuition, and that intuition was telling him that something about this accident was deeply wrong. He did not jump to conclusions. He signaled for his team to continue their forensic examination and began walking slowly along the concrete path leading to where the car had gone into the water. The road was quite narrow, just wide enough for one car. He crouched down, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the pavement. Nothing. Absolutely no skid marks. No tire tracks from sudden braking. No shattered pieces of a headlight or side mirror. The road surface was strangely clean. This suggested the car had entered the river smoothly, without any resistance or effort from the driver to brake or swerve. Lieutenant Grant returned to the vehicle. Putting on a pair of gloves, he carefully opened the passenger side door to get a better look inside. The victim, Ethan Hayes, was a tall, well-built man. He sat there, his face purplish from asphyxiation, yet his expression was eerily peaceful. Why? Why would a man facing certain death as cold water flooded his car show none of the most basic survival reflexes? Why did he not unbuckle his seatbelt, try to smash a window, or attempt to surface? A normal person would have thrashed about frantically, but Ethan Hayes had not. He had died in a posture that was too neat, too calm. "Something is not right here," Lieutenant Grant said quietly to a subordinate. "Prepare to notify the victim's family, and tell the forensics team I want a thorough autopsy." About an hour later, the victim's wife, Chloe Hayes, arrived at the scene. She came in a taxi, elegantly dressed and meticulously made up, her face hidden behind a pair of large designer sunglasses. As soon as she stepped out of the car and saw her husband's body, now removed from the vehicle and laid on a stretcher, she let out a piercing wail and collapsed as if she were about to faint. "Honey, why did you leave me and the kids like this?" Chloe shrieked, her voice so full of anguish it would have moved anyone to pity. She played the part of a grieving widow flawlessly, but none of it fooled Lieutenant Grant's professional eye. He noticed that while her mouth was wailing, behind the sunglasses, her eyes were completely dry. Instead, they held a calculating, assessing glint. She was watching the police, evaluating the situation. Lieutenant Grant approached her, his voice conveying condolences but also a firm authority. "My condolences to your family. We are the police. To clarify the cause of Mr. Hayes' death, regulations require us to conduct an autopsy. We will need your cooperation." At the word autopsy, Chloe Hayes abruptly stopped crying. She shot up, pulling off her sunglasses to reveal a pair of sharp eyes, devoid of any trace of grief. "An autopsy for what?" she said, her voice sharp and acidic. "My husband died in an accident. It is as clear as day. What is there to examine? He is gone. Can't you people just let him rest in peace?" Chloe's reaction was completely unexpected. Instead of agreeing in the interest of finding the truth, she objected vehemently, almost hysterically. This is a legal requirement," Lieutenant Grant explained patiently. "There are some questionable aspects of this incident that we need to clarify." "Questionable what?" "Do not you dare invent things to make a buck," Chloe snapped. "I do not consent. I am his legal wife. I have the right to decide. I will absolutely not allow anyone to touch my husband's body." With that, she threw herself onto the white sheet-covered stretcher, wailing theatrically. Chloe Hayes' unusual behavior and her fierce obstruction of the investigation turned Lieutenant Grant's suspicion into a near certainty. This woman was definitely hiding something. From a victim's relative, Chloe Hayes had just promoted herself to the prime suspect in a premeditated murder. The standoff continued for some time. Faced with Chloe's adamant refusal, the team could do nothing but temporarily transport the body to the county hospital morgue and await a decision from their superiors. Lieutenant Grant watched the woman's fake tears, a new line of investigation already forming in his mind. A psychological battle had just begun. Chloe Hayes' fierce and unusual resistance at the scene planted a deep seed of suspicion in Lieutenant Mason Grant's mind. A normal wife, confronted with the sudden death of her husband, no matter how grief-stricken, would want to find the truth, to know how her partner's final moments unfolded. Chloe's attitude was the opposite. It was the attitude of someone desperately trying to bury a secret. At the Major Crimes Unit office, Lieutenant Grant sat staring at a whiteboard. In the center was a portrait of Ethan Hayes. Surrounding it were initial notes on the case, including one line he had circled in red ink: "Wife vehemently refuses autopsy." This was the biggest knot in the case. Without forensic results, all his theories were just speculation, lacking the legal grounds to open a murder investigation. "We can't force her," he told his team in an emergency meeting. "By law, the spouse has the first right to decide, but not the only right. Immediately find out if Mr. Hayes has any other direct next of kin, specifically, his biological parents." The order was given, and the detectives moved quickly. Through a background check, they learned that Ethan Hayes' parents, Mr. Robert Hayes and Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, lived in Ardmore, a borough outside the city. They were retired professionals and did not live with their son and his wife. A team, led by Lieutenant Grant himself, set out immediately. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes' home was on a quiet, tree-lined street. When the officers entered, a heavy, mournful atmosphere filled the air. Mr. Hayes, a former military man, tried to maintain a stoic composure, but his eyes were red and swollen. Mrs. Hayes was nearly catatonic, sitting motionless on the sofa, clutching a wedding photograph of her son. Unlike Chloe's performance, their pain was real. It was present in every breath, every vacant stare. Lieutenant Grant offered his condolences and then carefully presented the entire situation, omitting no detail from the lack of skid marks and the victim's calm posture to their daughter-in-law's bizarre reaction. After listening, Mr. Hayes, the old soldier, slammed his hand on the table, his voice trembling with indignation. Chloe did that. Ethan is our son. Our flesh and blood. Why would she refuse an autopsy to find out the truth? Mrs. Hayes, who had been silent, suddenly broke into sobs. My son, my dear son. If something was wrong, you have to find it. Something was definitely wrong. My son was a very careful driver. There is no way he would have been careless enough to drive into a river like that. I am begging you, officers, please get to the bottom of this. We will agree to anything, as long as we can find out the truth about our son's death. The parents' consent was the key the investigators needed. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes signed the official request for a forensic examination through their tears. With a solid legal basis in hand, Lieutenant Grant knew the curtain of secrecy was about to be lifted. The autopsy was conducted shortly thereafter at the State Forensics Laboratory. Under the bright surgical lights, the state's best forensic pathologists worked with meticulous care. Outside, Lieutenant Grant and his team waited in silence. Every minute felt like an eternity. He knew the results of this examination would determine the entire direction of the case, drawing the fine line between an accident and a homicide. After hours of intense work, the chief medical examiner finally emerged, removing his surgical mask to reveal a grave expression. He invited Lieutenant Grant into his office. Lieutenant, our initial findings completely demolished the accident theory, he said as soon as the door closed. What did you find, Doctor? First, we examined the victim's stomach contents. It contained undigested food and herbal stew with a very strong medicinal aroma. This was his last meal, consumed an estimated 3 to 4 hours before his death. Herbal chicken stew, Lieutenant Grant murmured. A nutritious dish that requires elaborate preparation. Who would have cooked that for him? But that is not the most important part, the doctor continued, his voice lowering. We sent blood and gastric fluid samples for a toxicology screen, and the results were truly shocking. The victim, Ethan Hayes, had a very high concentration of phenobarbital in his blood and organs. The name immediately caught Lieutenant Grant's attention. He knew it was not an ordinary medication. It was a powerful barbiturate sedative that acts as a central nervous system depressant, strictly controlled and typically used to treat epilepsy or as a surgical anesthetic. In high doses, it induces a deep sleep, coma, and eventually, respiratory failure leading to death. The concentration of phenobarbital was high enough to be lethal on its own, the medical examiner confirmed. The perpetrator was very sophisticated. The characteristic bitter taste of the drug was almost completely masked by the strong aroma of the herbs in the stew. Mr. Hayes likely ate his final meal without any idea he was being poisoned. A horrifying truth was unveiled. Ethan Hayes had been poisoned. So the direct cause of death was phenobarbital overdose? Lieutenant Grant asked. No, the doctor shook his head. And this is the crux of the case. The victim's lungs were filled with water and diatom specific to Briar Creek. This proves that at the moment he was submerged, he was still breathing. His heart was still beating. Lieutenant Grant was silent, his mind assembling the pieces. The full picture of the crime was now coming into focus, clear and terrifying. The scenario was no longer a hypothesis. The killer, most likely his wife Chloe Hayes, had cooked a poison herbal chicken stew. After Ethan ate it, the drug took effect, sending him into a deep, inescapable sleeper coma. The killer then moved his unconscious body to the car, placed him in the driver's seat, and carefully fastened the seatbelt. Finally, the car was driven to the deserted riverbank and pushed into the cold water. Ethan Hayes did not die in an accident, nor did he die from the poison alone. He died from drowning. He died an agonizing death, completely helpless, as river water filled his lungs while he was lost in a coma induced by the very person who shared his bed. The crime was cold-blooded, calculated, and incredibly cruel. The staging of an accident was meticulously planned to deceive the authorities. If not for the sharp instincts of an experienced investigator and the resolve of the victim's family, this crime might have been buried forever at the bottom of the river. Lieutenant Grant stood up and shook the medical examiner's hand. Thank you, Doctor. This information is priceless. Leaving the forensics lab, Lieutenant Grant's face was like ice. The case had officially entered a new phase. He pulled out his phone and called his deputy. Notify the whole team, he said, his voice hard as steel. The incident in Lamont Township was not a traffic accident. It is a premeditated murder. Prime suspect, Chloe Hayes. Deploy special surveillance on her immediately. We need to find out if she acted alone or if she had an accomplice. The forensic results were a bombshell that shattered the perfect charade the killer had worked so hard to construct. The case now had a clear direction, and the spotlight was fixed on the widow, Chloe Hayes. Lieutenant Grant knew he was dealing with a formidable opponent. A woman who could poison her husband so ruthlessly and stage a crime scene so elaborately was undoubtedly someone with a steady nerve and a cold heart. In the days that followed, Chloe Hayes continued to play the part of the grieving widow to perfection. The funeral for director Ethan Hayes was a grand affair, attracting a large crowd of mourners, from business partners and employees to relatives and friends. Amidst the somber atmosphere, Chloe appeared in a black mourning dress, her face gaunt and sorrowful, always supported by relatives on either side. She wept uncontrollably by her husband's casket, recounting beautiful memories and unfinished plans. Her performance was so flawless that it moved everyone present to pity the young wife so tragically widowed. However, among the mourners were eyes that silently watched Chloe's every move. They belonged to detectives from the Major Crimes Unit, ordered to blend in with the crowd. They missed no detail how she greeted guests, her conversations, the people she interacted with. But Chloe was extremely cautious. She stayed close to her family and showed no suspicious behavior. After the funeral, a dense and covert surveillance network was cast around Chloe Hayes. Her every activity, from inside her luxurious mansion to her trips outside, was monitored by the task force. One team was stationed 24/7 in an old car parked in a discreet spot near her gate. Her phone calls and text messages were placed under special surveillance. For the first few days, Chloe laid low. She barely left the house, staying inside to receive guests offering late condolences. Her schedule was monotonously simple: wake up late, eat sparingly, and sit in one place to receive visitors. The detectives waited patiently. They knew that no matter how cunning the fox, it would eventually show its tail. And they were right. After about a week of seclusion, thinking that things had quieted down and her husband's death had been officially closed as an accident, Chloe began to make her first moves. She started going out more. At first, it was just short trips to the supermarket, a spa, or a familiar cafe. She always went alone, dressed more simply, and maintained a mournful expression. But the surveillance team followed without letting up. They logged her schedule and photographed every place she went and every person she met, no matter how brief the encounter. The first breakthrough came one afternoon. Chloe drove her Mercedes to a large shopping mall. She parked and went straight into the supermarket. The detectives quickly followed, keeping a safe distance. Chloe wandered through the aisles, picking up a few trivial items. When she reached the houseware section, a man in a dress shirt and slacks who was looking at the shelves accidentally bumped his cart into hers. "Oh, I am so sorry, the man said hastily. "It is fine," Chloe replied coolly. The interaction lasted only a few seconds, but the detective's trained eye caught the anomaly. In that brief moment, he saw the man discreetly slip a small object into Chloe's palm. They never made eye contact and immediately went their separate ways as if they were complete strangers. Chloe quickly paid for her items and left. This furtive action did not escape the surveillance team. A portrait photo of the unknown man was immediately sent to the command center. An urgent identity search was launched, and the results came back within hours. The man in the photo was identified as Dylan Cole, 39, a sales manager for a private company. But it was information about his past that stunned the entire task force. By checking all high school records, investigators discovered that Dylan Cole was Chloe Hayes' high school sweetheart. An old flame, seemingly buried by time, had suddenly reappeared at an incredibly sensitive moment. All the pieces of the puzzle now fell into place. The motive was no longer a mystery. It was clear and stark. Chloe Hayes and her former lover had conspired to murder her husband to inherit the massive fortune Ethan Hayes left behind and, more importantly, to be free to be together. The investigation now had a new target. A second surveillance team was immediately established to tail Dylan Cole. Comparing Chloe's and Dylan's movements over the past few days, detectives found a suspicious pattern. They were often at the same public places at the same time but always maintained their distance and never showed any sign of knowing each other. It was the behavior of people trying to conceal an illicit affair. As their caution waned, the lovers' meetings became more frequent and brazen. They no longer met in crowded places like malls but moved to more secluded locations. One evening, The surveillance team followed Dylan Cole to a quiet garden cafe on the outskirts of the city. 15 minutes later, a taxi pulled up outside, and Chloe Hayes got out, dressed stylishly, with no trace of the grieving widow about her. She walked straight to a private gazebo in the most hidden corner of the cafe, where Dylan was waiting. Under the dim yellow light, from a vantage point, the detectives used a camera with a telephoto lens to document the entire meeting. They no longer kept their distance or pretended to be strangers. Chloe sat closely in Dylan's lap, and they shared passionate kisses. They talked and laughed, their faces illuminated with the satisfaction and happiness of people who had achieved their goal. The photographs became irrefutable proof of Chloe Hayes' extramarital affair. Lieutenant Grant looked at the images, where the radiant smile of the widow contrasted grotesquely with the memorial photo of her ill-fated husband. He knew he was dealing with a cold-blooded pair, a combination of greed, lust, and cruelty. The net was tightening. The task force had identified the two perpetrators and understood their motive. But to secure a conviction, they needed more. They needed physical evidence, scientific proof that could directly link Chloe and Dylan to the act of murder. The battle now moved to a new front of evidence, and Lieutenant Grant knew that in the digital age, no crime could be committed without leaving a trace. The photos from the secret rendezvous between Chloe Hayes and Dylan Cole became undeniable proof of their illicit relationship. Now, the task force had not just one suspect, but a criminal alliance built on a foundation of betrayal and lust. Lieutenant Grant convened an emergency meeting. On the whiteboard, next to Chloe's photo, a picture of Dylan Cole was pinned up. A red line was drawn, connecting the two lovers. "We have the motive, and we have the two subjects," Lieutenant Grant said decisively. "But to convict them, feelings and speculation are not enough. We need physical evidence. Evidence that we can put on the table in front of a jury and make it impossible for them to deny. The mission now is to tear apart their pasts, especially in the period before and during the crime. Let's start with something they cannot completely erase, their digital footprint." The order was given. The detectives, in coordination with the State Police Cybercrime Unit, went to work. With solid legal grounds, a warrant was executed to collect the telecommunications data for the phone numbers belonging to Chloe Hayes and Dylan Cole. A detailed analysis of their call logs and GPS cell tower locations for the 3 months prior to Ethan's murder was placed on Lieutenant Grant's desk. The dry numbers, when juxtaposed, told a story of a passionate and illicit affair. For the first 2 months, the frequency of contact between Chloe and Dylan was astonishing. Some days, they called each other dozens of times, supplemented by hundreds of text messages. The location data showed that whenever Ethan Hayes was away on business, Chloe's and Dylan's phone signals almost always pinged from the same location, a luxury apartment complex where Dylan was renting a unit. They had turned his home into a paradise for their secret trysts. But the most striking detail was the sudden change in the final week before the murder. The frequency of calls dropped sharply, replaced by exchanges on encrypted messaging apps like Telegram. And then, on the evening of May 19th, the night Ethan was believed to have had his accident, an eerie silence fell over both phones. From 7 p.m. until 8 a.m. the next morning, not a single call or text was recorded between the two numbers. "This is not the silence of distance," an analyst noted. "This is the silence of people who are in the same place, carrying out a plan together, with no need to communicate by phone." The cell tower analysis from that fateful night reinforced this conclusion. The phone signals of both Chloe and Dylan were pinging from the same tower covering the area of Ethan Hayes' mansion. The data proved they were together. But to know what they said and did, the task force needed to dig deeper. With this initial evidence, an emergency search warrant for Dylan Cole's residence was approved. A team quickly raided his apartment. The search yielded several crucial pieces of evidence, including Dylan's laptop and a few old phones. The tech experts began their work. They knew that even if a user deletes data, traces can remain in cloud backups or be recovered from the device's memory. They were not disappointed. After 2 days of relentless work, they successfully recovered the entire chat history from a messaging app between Chloe Hayes and Dylan Cole messages the pair had carefully deleted, thinking they were gone forever. When the transcript of these messages was placed on the table, Lieutenant Grant and his team felt a wave of disgust. These were not love letters, they were the script for a murder, discussed in cold, meticulous detail. "Just get through tonight, and our future will be wide open," Chloe had texted Dylan on the afternoon before the murder. How are your preparations going? Will that special chicken stew be effective? Dylan replied, Do not worry. I tested a small dose on him before. He just thought he was tired and slept more soundly. Tonight, I am giving him the whole thing. He will go to sleep and never wake up. The chilling messages exposed the entire plan. The special chicken stew was the herbal stew laced with phenobarbital. They had planned it in advance, with Chloe even testing the drug on her husband to gauge his reaction. The love they professed was built on a murder plot. The our future they spoke of was one built on Ethan Hayes' grave. The evidence was overwhelming, but Lieutenant Grant wanted one final, decisive blow, irrefutable physical evidence that would silence any attempt at denial in court. He ordered a team to review all security camera footage in the area around the victim's home and on the routes leading to Briar Creek. It was a grueling task. Dozens of cameras and hundreds of hours of footage had to be meticulously reviewed. The detectives stayed up for nights on end, their eyes glued to the monitors, replaying segments over and over. After days of searching in vain, when everyone was nearing exhaustion and despair, a final glimmer of light appeared. A security camera on a private residence, located at a corner about 300 meters from the gate of the Hayes mansion, had captured a priceless image. Due to the obstructed angle and poor image quality, it had been initially overlooked. But when forensic video analysts filtered out the noise and enhanced the brightness, a horrifying scene emerged. At 1:30 a.m. on May 20th, Ethan Hayes' black Toyota Camry slowly rolled out of the gate. The streetlights illuminated the driver's cabin just enough to identify the person behind the wheel, Chloe Hayes. But what made every investigator shudder was when they zoomed in on the back seat. Dimly, through the rear window, a man's face could be seen looking back, as if keeping watch. It was Dylan Cole. The video clip lasted only a few seconds, but it was the most damning evidence of all. It proved that in the middle of the night, it was Chloe Hayes who drove her husband's car, carrying her lover and her husband's dying body towards the fateful river. All denials, all deceptions, were rendered meaningless by this footage. Lieutenant Grant looked at the still frame extracted from the video, his face emotionless. He closed the case file. The cat and mouse game was over. He picked up the phone, his voice cold and resolute. Execute the arrest warrants for Chloe Hayes and Dylan Cole. Now. The data analysis and the security camera footage were the final trump cards, ending the silent investigation. It was time for the curtain to fall on the charade. Lieutenant Grant understood that with cold-blooded individuals like Chloe Hayes and Dylan Cole, the element of surprise was key to breaking through their psychological defenses. Early the next morning, two teams moved in simultaneously. The first, led by Grant himself, raided the luxurious mansion of Ethan Hayes. The heavy iron gates were breached. Chloe, dressed in an expensive silk nightgown, was calmly sipping coffee and reading a fashion magazine in the living room. When she saw the police storm in with arrest and search warrants, her face went pale. The smug smile vanished, replaced by an unmistakable look of terror. The performance of the grieving widow was no longer needed. Before the cold gaze of the lead investigator, the true face of a monster was revealed. "What are you doing? You have no right," Chloe stammered, her voice cracking with fear. "We have more than enough evidence to prove your direct involvement in the death of your husband, Ethan Hayes," Lieutenant Grant said, his voice devoid of emotion. "It is over, Ms. Hayes." At the same time, the second team arrived at Dylan Cole's apartment. He was getting ready for work, his shirt still unbuttoned. When the door burst open and investigators swarmed in, Dylan froze. The romantic lover who had plotted a rosy future with his mistress now stood ashen-faced, with no color left in his cheeks. Both Chloe Hayes and Dylan Cole were handcuffed and escorted to the state police headquarters, to the astonishment of their neighbors and colleagues. They were placed in separate interrogation rooms, completely isolated from one another, a standard tactic to prevent collusion and maximize psychological pressure. For the first few hours, both were defiant. They either remained silent or offered flat denials. Chloe insisted she was being framed, that she was a wife who loved her husband dearly. Dylan claimed he was just an old friend comforting Chloe in her time of grief, nothing more. They believed that as long as they did not confess, the police would have nothing on them in a case with no direct witnesses. Lieutenant Grant listened patiently to all the lies. He did not interrupt or show any impatience. He let them dig their own graves. When they were tired and their patience was wearing thin, he signaled to begin the confrontation with evidence. In Chloe's interrogation room, a large monitor was turned on. The investigator started with the call logs and GPS data. The dense columns of signal pings, the hours-long calls in the middle of the night, were displayed for her to see. If you were just friends consoling each other, why was the communication so frequent? And why were your phone signals always in the same place on the days your husband was out of town? Chloe became flustered. We were just talking to get through it. Is that right? The investigator said, then played the recovered text messages. The words special chicken stew and our future appeared on the screen. Chloe's face went white. She began to breathe heavily, her hands clenched together. How do you explain these messages? What is this special chicken stew? Is it the same stew containing phenobarbital that we found in your husband's stomach? The final blow was delivered. The security camera footage was played. The image of the familiar Camry, with Chloe herself behind the wheel at 1:30 a.m. And then, the blurry image of Dylan Cole in the backseat. At that moment, Chloe Hayes' defenses completely crumbled. She knew any further denial was futile. She hung her head, her whole body trembling. Then she burst into tears, but this time, they were tears of fear and desperation. It was not me. She screamed. It was him. It was all his idea. He pushed me to do it. Once she started confessing, her tone shifted entirely. She began a new performance, the pitiful victim. She started pinning all the blame on her lover. Chloe claimed that Dylan had orchestrated the entire plan, telling her that only Ethan's death would allow them to be free and live a life of luxury. She portrayed herself as a weak woman, blinded by her love for Dylan and easily manipulated. He gave me the drugs, she sobbed. He told me how to put it in the food. He came to my house that night. After my husband was unconscious, he helped me drag him to the car. I only drove, pushing the car into the river. That was all him. Meanwhile, in the next room, Dylan Cole was confronted with the same evidence. When the investigator informed him that Chloe had confessed and named him as the mastermind, Dylan exploded with rage. The blinding love he had professed turned into pure hatred. That damn bitch. Dylan roared. She dares to say that? She was the mastermind. She has hated her husband for years. And Dylan began to tell a completely different version of the story. According to him, it was Chloe who had reinitiated contact and seduced him. She constantly complained about her unhappy marriage, about a husband who was abusive and stingy. It was Chloe who proposed getting rid of Ethan to claim his assets. He, blinded by love and her promises of a happy future, had only agreed to help. The confessions of the two killers, though contradictory in their blame shifting, perfectly reconstructed the entire horrifying crime when pieced together. That night, after Chloe successfully drugged her husband, she texted Dylan to come over. Together, they struggled to drag Ethan's unconscious body from the bedroom down to the Camry parked in the driveway. Chloe drove while Dylan sat in the back, watching over the body. They drove to the deserted spot on the bank of Briar Creek. There, using all their strength, they pushed the car, carrying a still-breathing man, into the cold water. Then they calmly called a taxi and went home as if nothing had happened. The love they had celebrated had now become a weapon they used against each other in a battle for their own survival. Their criminal alliance, built on lies, ended in betrayal. The confession of the cold-blooded lovers officially closed the investigation into the murder of director Ethan Hayes. Their crime, though concealed by an elaborate performance and extreme deceit, had finally been exposed to the light of justice. Criminal proceedings were initiated swiftly. Both Chloe Hayes and Dylan Cole were charged with first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances, including criminal conspiracy, premeditation, and heinous motive. Several months later, the Court of Common Pleas of Crestwood County opened the trial. The case of a wife and her lover poisoning her husband and staging it as an accident sent shockwaves through the public. From early morning, the area around the courthouse was packed with people who had come to witness the judgment of a pair whose actions had trampled on every foundation of morality and decency. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with indignation. In the front row, reserved for the victim's family, Mr. and Mrs. Hayes sat, their hair visibly grayer after only a few months. The pain of losing their son had transformed two once healthy, vibrant people into silent shadows, etched with an indelible sorrow. Chloe Hayes and Dylan Cole were led to the defendant's stand. They were no longer the passionate, infatuated lovers from their secret dates. Now, they were mortal enemies. They deliberately avoided looking at each other, their faces cold, their eyes glinting with hatred. The love they had once extolled, the love that had motivated them to take a human life, had now curdled into absolute loathing. The district attorney's indictment was read, each word a hammer blow against the conscience of everyone present. Every text message, every phone call, every detail of the plan to poison and dispose of the body was recounted in stark detail. The courtroom was silent, broken only by occasional whispers of outrage. During questioning, both Chloe and Dylan admitted to their actions the evidence was too overwhelming to deny. But when asked about their respective roles, a new, ugly battle of blame began. Chloe, with her crocodile tears, continued to play the part of a pitiful woman blinded by love. She claimed she was psychologically manipulated by Dylan, coerced and threatened by him. She was, she said, merely a tool in his plan. Dylan, in turn, was not to be outdone. He accused Chloe of being the true mastermind, a devil in an angel's disguise. He said she had planned everything, from buying the drugs and testing them to choosing the disposal site. He was just a love-struck fool, used by a manipulative and wicked woman. Their blame game failed to deceive the experienced panel of judges. The truth was clear. This was a crime born of mutual consent and close cooperation. Neither of them was a victim. They were both monsters. The most moving moment of the trial came when Mr. Robert Hayes, the victim's father, was allowed to give a statement. The old soldier stood up, his back straight, his voice trembling but firm. "Your Honours," he said, "what did my son, Ethan, do to deserve such a painful and despicable death? He worked hard to provide for his family, to give his wife a life of comfort. And for that, he was poisoned by the woman who shared his bed, drowned while he was in a coma. This pain, how are we supposed to live with this?" He turned to look directly at the two defendants. "Your love was built on the blood and tears of my son. You do not deserve to live. You do not deserve any mercy from the law." After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. The presiding judge, in a stern voice, declared, "The actions of the defendants are exceptionally grievous, cruel, and devoid of humanity, causing extreme outrage in our society. The defendants meticulously conspired to take the victim's life for their own base desires and bottomless greed. This crime must be met with the strictest possible sentence as a deterrent. This court finds the defendants, Chloe Hayes and Dylan Cole, guilty of murder in the first degree. The court sentences both defendants to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was delivered, but there was no applause in the courtroom, only a heavy silence and the heartbroken sobs of the victim's family. A life sentence was perhaps too lenient for such a heinous crime, but it was the highest judgment the law could provide. The two perpetrators were led away, ending their illicit affair with the rest of their lives behind bars. The case was closed, but it left a deep scar on the community, a terrifying lesson about the dangers of greed and betrayal. It showed that sometimes the greatest enemy is not a stranger, but the person closest to you, the one you trust the most. And it served as a chilling reminder of how cruel and vicious people can become when all sense of morality is lost.